There's a lot of people who think that people with a personality disorder can't change.
In my head.
You know personality disorders aren't real, right? Okay, so their symptoms might be real, the behaviors that we see with the personality disorder might be real, but the personality disorders themselves are not real. They're just categories that were invented for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, to categorize people and to label them. But let's talk about the history of that, because it's important if we want to understand what personality disorders are and why we give them these labels in the first place. Now, personality disorders have been around since the first DSM came out, the first edition of the DSM that was in the 1950s. Back then, you might have heard of a personality disorder referred to as a character disorder, and they were lumped all together with all the other disorders. There wasn't anything special seen about them, but they were basically defined as a pattern of behaviors, a pattern that was distressing to the person experiencing it. And beyond that, they didn't really elaborate too much, because back when the DSM-1 was made, they thought more about people as whole people, and they wanted to get to know people and be interested in what people were experiencing, and it wasn't so much about categorizing and labeling people. As time has gone on, things have changed. From DSM-1 to DSM-3, there was a lot of changes. For one thing, some personality disorders disappeared, for example, passive-aggressive personality disorder, and other personality disorders emerged, such as narcissistic personality disorder. So what happened in DSM-3? Well, by the time we got to the DSM-3, the field of psychology as a whole was struggling to legitimize itself. People were saying, well, this is all just kind of nonsense. You can just make it up. You can categorize things however you want. And so they needed a way to measure things. And when it came to personality disorder specifically, they said, okay, we're going to give these things labels. They're going to be put into categories, and then we're going to measure them based on the behaviors that we're observing people do. Now, this was actually very helpful because it did allow us to measure things. However, when they made DSM-3, they put personality disorders on what they called their own axis. So they were in a separate category from the rest of the disorders, like anxiety disorders, depressive, bipolar, and the rest. And so when people exhibited symptoms of a personality disorder, the theory was that this was something different from the anxiety disorders, and this was a misstep. This is something that later was corrected in DSM-5 a little bit, because they started to shift towards a dimensional model of looking at things and not just a categorical model. So now, instead of looking at people as a label, as a diagnosis in and of itself, they started to break away those axes, put everything back together and say, you know what, there's a possibility here that maybe somebody's anxiety and anxiety disorder is causing a personality disorder, or vice versa. It could be that there's a personality disorder that's causing these underlying phobias and things going on. And we started to see things come back together a little bit more in the DSM-5. I know this is a lot of technical information. Stick with me because it's really interesting. Now, in DSM-5, they put together a specific task force for observing personality disorders, and they wanted to come up with a new dimensional model, as I mentioned. So what this task force did was they came up with a trait model of looking at personality disorders, and they found that there are 25 maladaptive personality traits that somebody could have. They could be expressed at different severities, and depending on how severe each trait is expressing and the cluster of traits that are expressing together, that would define whether somebody was experiencing a personality disorder. Under this trait model, which you can find in the back of the DSM-5, and it can be used to diagnose somebody, they also eliminated a number of personality disorders, bringing it down to avoidant, antisocial, borderline, narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and schizotypal personality disorders. Now, I personally really like the trait model because as a general model for general purpose use, it allows us to see people as whole people again and not as a label defining exactly how they are. And it also helps us to understand that people's personalities do change over time as these traits are expressed more, or they come back and depend on how we modify our behavior and our relation to ourselves. But the story doesn't end there. We have further to go when it comes to classifying personality disorders and conceptualizing disorders as a whole. So the movement now seems to be moving in a different direction. One direction that we seem to be moving in is into looking into domains of psychopathology. Psychopathology is any kind of mental problem. And so when it comes to the domains of psychopathology, what we're looking at are things like, how does somebody respond to fear? Do they become hyperexcitable? Do they inhibit their feelings and shut down? Do they have a high heart rate? Are they respirating quickly? How is their blood pressure? All of these kinds of things are happening in the body. We experience them in the body, but they relate to our mental state. And so that's another way of conceptualizing mental disorders. One important model that may be the future of mental illness is looking at the neural systems model. The neural systems model asks us to look at the observable signs of mental illness, the subjective experience the person is going through, their neurocognitive functioning, their neurobehavioral systems, their genetic and epigenetic factors that may have contributed to the mental illness, as well as environmental factors like trauma. One of the benefits of using this model is that instead of just looking at traits now, we're looking at how the different traits interact and what thresholds have to be met to make those systems activate and make those traits interact with each other. Another model that people are looking at when it comes to personality is an interpersonal model, and what an interpersonal model focuses on is how people interact with each other. What they're particularly looking at are the axes of agency, so whether you have dominance or submission over another person, and the axis of communion, so whether you approach somebody with a warm feeling or whether you feel cold to them and you avoid them. An important aspect of the interpersonal model is whether somebody gets stuck in a pattern of relating to people, whether they have to keep doing it the same way, or whether they can be adaptable and flexible depending on the situation and the people that they're around. We also have the Cognitive Affective Processing Systems model, also known as CAPS. CAPS looks at the different way that we have thoughts and we have feelings about what we're reacting to in our environment, and specifically it looks at things like rejection sensitivity and empathy. So really the takeaway here is that yes, personality disorder symptoms are real. What people go through is real. It's not that they're making it up, but we have a hard time conceptualizing these things and we're still learning. And hopefully as we move on, we try on these different models, we'll get a greater understanding of what's happening in somebody's experience, and we'll be able to say, this is how you treat this personality disorder. I know there's a lot of people who think that people with a personality disorder can't change, or maybe they can change and they're just making it up and they just need to think differently or do things differently. But I hope illustrating this has shown you that that's not the case. We have learned a lot since DSM I. DSM I, people believe that your personality was fixed and it could never be changed. DSM V, we're doing away with some of these labels, and possibly we'll be doing away with them completely in the future for an entirely new model and a new understanding of what a personality disorder is. If you're new to my channel, I have over 250 videos on mental health. Hit subscribe and hit the bell after you hit subscribe to get notified each time that I do a new video. There is something here for you. I also have a whole series on personality traits. My mission is to humanize mental health. If you want to help me on that mission, you can do so over on Patreon. I'll put the link up here above. If you have any thoughts on this, if you have any ideas on how we should conceptualize personality disorders, leave those down below and let us know what you think about everything. Thank you for joining me here in the woods again tonight as the sun goes down. I'll see you around next time, everyone.